So I'm here today with Thant Myint-U. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's really wonderful to have you at this moment. We're recording this a week before the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and your grandfather, U Thant, was the Secretary-General of the United Nations at a particularly tumultuous time in global geopolitics in the 1960s. We were in the middle of the, Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There were, conflicts springing up in Africa related to postcolonial political maneuvering. There was the war in Vietnam. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in the middle of all of this sat U Thant, who, and it shows very much in your book, Peacemaker, really had to define for himself what the role of the United Nations could be in these conflicts. So I'd love to just hear from you. What inspired you to write this book, and how did it feel going back through the archives of these events and learning a little bit more about your grandfather?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. It was, in some ways, it was an accidental book. I was, a few years ago, I was thinking of writing a new book, but I was actually thinking of writing a book on 18th century colonial history.
Okay.
And I came across the UN archive and realized that thousands of his documents had been declassified over the years, and about 80% had been digitized. And as I looked through the documents, which included not just his official papers, but thousands of family papers and things from hotel receipts to medical records to everything else, I just found myself really drawn to what seemed to be a story that hadn't been told. I went to the library, read everything I could on the Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, everything else, and realized also that what was in the archive was very different from the way in which the 1960s and the global history of the 1960s had been told so far.
Right.
So I was interested in that, but I was also interested in something else, which was something I knew about him but hadn't really reflected on or thought very much about, which was that he came from this really small town in Burma.
Right.
It was a small town of mainly wooden houses without electricity or running water, about a day travel from the big city, from Rangoon at the time. And when he was 39 years old, almost 40, he decided on a mid-career or midlife career change. He had been a school teacher in that town and only living in that town up until that point. And within 10 years, he was Burma's ambassador in New York, living in Midtown Manhattan, working at the UN. And within 3 years, he became the UN Secretary-General. So I was interested in thinking about how that happened and the person that he was and how he met those challenges in the 60s. So the book is a result of that.
Yeah, I think the early life is very fascinating, and you go through it in the book, I think, quite well. I mean, it's clear from his early beginnings that there were some principles and points of pride for him, particularly on education, that remained throughout his tenure at the United Nations. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about why he was chosen for Secretary General and what those early experiences might have brought to the table different from other Secretaries General.
I mean, it was a mix of things, right? So I think the UN was then not just facing a whole series of different challenges, but was undergoing its own really basic transformation. So if we just take a step back from his story and remember that the UN was born as a wartime alliance. Franklin Roosevelt, who was the main thinker and architect behind the founding of the UN, thought of the organization as a peace organization that would enforce the peace and would be based on the Americans' alliance with the Soviet Union and with the UK as well.
That did not pan out.
And it didn't pan out because of the Cold War. Even before the ink was dry in San Francisco, it was clear that that conception of the UN as this military alliance to deter future aggression was not going to work.
Right.
And for a while, it wasn't really clear how the UN was going to work, and there were different conceptions. And it was only until the late 1950s when countries like Burma, but newly decolonized countries, came into the UN, that they embraced it, wanted it to work, wanted it to make it a genuine instrument for peace at a time of the Cold War. So he was from one of those countries that was transforming the UN, and he developed a reputation as the ambassador, the person in New York who got along with everyone. And I think that was something that he brought from his earlier career, even in that little town, as the headmaster of the school and trying to get along with people. He was very extroverted. But I think, to answer your question directly, I think he was very much someone who saw himself as a pragmatist, who looked for compromise and he looked for solutions. And I think he always imagined himself as a bridge builder, especially between countries like Burma, which had been part of an empire, and the West as well. So I think that was an instinct that he had that I think people, Western governments saw. They saw him as someone from the third world, but also someone that they could relate to and who was friendly towards them as well.
Right. It was an incredible position to be in, actually, at that moment, to be kind of acceptable to all of these major powers that were themselves at odds. Maybe a reflection of where we are today as well, as we look to the next the appointment of the next Secretary-General. One lesson might be who would be acceptable to all sides at this point. Of course, we're in a very different position now with between the U.S., China, and Russia, particularly with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I was wondering, I wanted to talk a little bit about how U Thant saw the role of the UN system, particularly for the post-colonial powers. You mentioned that, the part of the impetus to choose him as Secretary General was his experience in this area at a time when there was vast decolonization across the countries, what we now call the Global South. So I think that what comes through in the book is that he had excellent relationships with the key leaders of all of those countries and a real desire to elevate their voices in the UN. Can you walk us through, what were some of the early challenges he faced in promoting a more inclusive vision of the world at the United Nations, and how did he kind of go about taking that idea of making sure that everyone was heard and putting it into action?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that, during the Cold War, or for us sitting here in New York, pretty much anywhere in the West, we think of 20th century history as the history of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and the post-Cold War era, and whatever we're in now. Whereas I think for most of the people in the world, in the countries that we might now call the Global South, the history of the 20th century is a history of empire and post-empire, and that transition over the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I think if we go back to 1961, which is when he became Secretary General, the UN was in existential crisis.
Right.
The Secretary General, his predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, had just been killed in a plane crash in the Congo.
Right, under perhaps mysterious circumstances.
Very mysterious and almost certainly involving foul play. The UN was facing a deep financial crisis. It was bankrupt. It was impossible to imagine at that time Moscow and Washington agreeing on someone at the very height of the Cold War. And they were facing this challenge in the Congo, where we kind of think about it now sometimes as a Cold War issue, but it was actually a North-South issue, where for the European powers, they really wanted this to be an example by backing this secession movement in Katanga, where they could grant independence to countries like the Congo, but still kind of do what they wanted to do.
Right,
And for the
both
African,
worlds.
yeah, exactly, right. and intervene, call things a humanitarian crisis and intervene. And the Katanga, which was the richest part of the Congo, rich in mineral resources, would be the line below which, in southern Africa, white rule would continue, directly or indirectly. And for the African and Asian countries that were at the UN, including Burma at the time, it was the exact opposite. This was a test of whether independence would really mean independence.
Right.
That it wouldn't just be a piece of paper in a ceremony that the British and French had or held.
Empire in another name, basically.
Yeah, empire in another name or informal empire, but instead would mean equality in a new international system that they would help to create. So that was the context in which he became Secretary General. The Congo became his first big test. Right. He took a much tougher line than his predecessor against the Katanga secession. And then within 9 months, he had built up, through his early efforts and diplomatic efforts, very good personal relations with John F. Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev.
Right.
And that put him in good stead to help intervene in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1961.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that a little bit too, because that's a fascinating case study in the book of what U Thant did. From my perspective, is what all good diplomats and statesmen should do, which is to create space. It's creating space for policy options. What you don't want, especially in a time like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we're literally staring down perhaps a nuclear escalation, what you don't want is for countries to feel like they're locked into an increasingly hostile position. So walk us through a little bit of how this happened. Tell us a little bit about what you learned about U Thant's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how would that type of leadership apply to today's world?
I think in October of 1961, President Kennedy on the 22nd of that month goes on TV, announces that there are Soviet missiles in Cuba.
Right.
We now know that there were many more missiles already armed with nuclear warheads, and tens of thousands more Soviet troops in Cuba than the Americans thought at the time. So we really were on the verge of a potential nuclear holocaust. Kennedy announces a blockade of Cuba, and Soviet ships are still streaming towards the island.
Right.
Khrushchev turns around some of those ships, but some are still heading towards the blockade line. So that's the 23rd, 24th of October.
This is very early on in his tenure.
Very early on. He was 9 months in.
9 months in.
And 13 years out of leaving his little town in Burma as a school teacher.
Right.
And he immediately goes to work. He realizes the urgency of the situation. He doesn't say anything publicly for a while, for the first 24 hours, but he's in deep consultation with the other Afro-Asian ambassadors. They call themselves the Afro-Asians as a bloc, the non-aligned ambassadors in New York, and through messages with non-aligned leaders around the world, like Nehru in India, like Nkrumah in Ghana, for example. And he decides without any mandate that he's going to intervene in this crisis. So he goes to the Security Council. He sets out what would become the framework for resolution, which is a trade of the Soviet missiles in Cuba for an American pledge of non-intervention in the island. And he sends messages to both Kennedy and Khrushchev, asking Khrushchev not to send any more offensive weapons to Cuba.
Right, to like basically pause at that point.
To pause for 2 weeks. And we don't know for the first day or so what the Soviets were going to do. The Americans didn't like the idea in the beginning.
Sure.
But Kennedy that night had a kind of light bulb moment when he realizes that somehow this UN Secretary-General could be this neutral point of reference and useful in creating that space that you mentioned. And so the White House wakes him up in the middle of the night, asks him to send another message, asking Khrushchev to turn around all the ships heading towards the blockade line. And within a day, again at the height of the crisis, Khrushchev sends a message agreeing that U Thant would be their mediator and agreeing to send the ships back. And there's much more, and there's much more complexity to the story, but the key thing is at that critical moment, it was much easier for the Russians to back down or accept a request from a neutral UN Secretary-General from the Afro-Asian movement in the Afro-Asian countries than an ultimatum from an American president.
Right.
And for Kennedy, it was something else, because if you listen to the audio tapes, on at least a couple of occasions, when his advisors are saying, you have to take tough action, we have to invade Cuba, today, not tomorrow, he says, we have to wait for U Thant's diplomacy. So Kennedy also is using that intervention by U Thant to create some space and time to figure out exactly what to do. And I think all three men in different ways, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and U Thant, realized that this was at its heart a political crisis, not a military crisis. And they all had to find a way back.
Right.
And so for U Thant, it was about crafting exactly that right intervention that could be the catalyst for creating that dynamic. He also goes later to Havana and meets with Fidel Castro, and that's also a critical component of de-escalating the crisis as well.
Right, and you note in the book how Fidel Castro was probably, the most displeased by this process of diplomacy. Of course, he wanted, for his own reasons, to be able to play, this game a little bit more towards Cuba's interests.
Absolutely. And he was really upset with not just Kennedy and the Americans, obviously, but with Khrushchev as well for
Right.
beginning to make a deal over his head.
Right.
So when U Thant goes down and talks to him, he says they have a one-to-one, and he says, I'm from a small country, you're from a small country, you have every right to have missiles, foreign alliances, you are sovereign, this is what we're fighting for, decolonization, the sovereignty of countries. But I'm trying to paint you a bigger picture. We're all on the brink of a nuclear war,
Right.
and we have to take a deep breath and take a step back. And he says, Castro, on television the next day, as he begins his process of de-escalating on his side, he says, U Thant showed us respect. And so I think for Castro as well, that was a missing ingredient that I think even Hammarskjöld, as a Western Secretary-General, would have had difficulty in conveying
Right.
in the way that U Thant was able to convey.
Right. No, that's a very good point. I think what also comes through in the book really clearly is how U Thant really developed personal relationships with many of the leaders and their key envoys or emissaries, so that he could, at times perhaps outmaneuver or work around obstructions that were happening in the system. So that, I think, is a clear takeaway for me from the book, is that he did approach everybody with this common humanity. And there's some amazing kind of vignettes in the book about swimming in Crimea and the Black Sea with Khrushchev, and other ways that he was able to personally connect private meetings between himself and the United States presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, et cetera. So I encourage everybody to read the book to draw out some of those interesting stories. It really makes the history come alive.
Thank you.
I think one area where U Thant faced significant criticism was for agreeing to withdraw UN emergency forces from Sinai in 1967 at the request of Egyptian President Nasser. So many people see this as the turning point in the lead up to the Six-Day War. What do you think this reveals about the limit of UN peacekeeping authority? I'd love to actually draw from your personal experience on this too, not just from what happened in the book, because you have had some experience facilitating UN peacekeeping operations, including in places where conflict continues to evolve, for the Thai-Cambodia border, for most recently. Give us a sense of how peacekeeping authority has changed over time, how this particular decision was received, and how you see that evolving in the context of the UN peacekeeping missions since then.
I mean, peacekeeping became a much more complex thing in the 1990s when you had these big peace agreements that were agreed in the late 80s, early 90s. Cambodia was one of the places that I served in 1992, 1993. I was in Bosnia in the mid-1990s, which was in some ways a failed peacekeeping mission, especially with the genocide that happened in Srebrenica in 1995. And I think by the late 1990s, there was a feeling that these very complex peacekeeping operations could sometimes be really important and really make a positive contribution and lead to lasting peace, but that we often didn't have the wherewithal, the resources, the political backing to make them work in the right way, and sometimes not even the knowledge of the countries in which we were working to understand exactly how to thread the needle between a conflict situation and a sustainable peace. I think back then in the 50s and 60s, peacekeeping was seen in a much more simple way. These were these classical peacekeeping operations where you had lightly armed soldiers from neutral countries essentially monitoring a confrontation line or a ceasefire line.
Right, a buffer zone.
A buffer zone, and reporting back to capitals, not to capitals, but to the Security Council if there was infringement of that ceasefire, trying to manage it and trying to dampen down any hostilities. So this is the case in Kashmir, in Cyprus, and in a way in Sinai on the Egyptian-Israeli armistice line.
Right.
And it was never meant to be a war-making force. It was less than or about 3,000 very lightly armed soldiers.
Right.
This was in 1967, who were placed there after the Suez Crisis, in part to allow the British and the French who had invaded Egypt together with Israel a face-saving withdrawal from the crisis. And they were there at the behest or with the understanding of the Egyptian government at the time.
Right.
So I think Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, he requested U Thant to withdraw the troops. U Thant tried to play for time. He felt that, given where he'd come from and the commitment he had to state sovereignty, he definitely didn't want to go against Egypt's sovereign right to expel that peacekeeping force, at least in principle. But at the same time, I think he realized that withdrawing those troops could escalate the crisis towards a potential all-out war between Egypt and Israel. In some ways, it's a red herring in the sense that that force was never going to stop a war if Egypt and Israel wanted to go to war.
Sure.
And in the end, actually, they were still there when Israel invaded the Sinai a few weeks later. But having said that, I think he did make mistakes. And I think in those days after he had been, the request had come in to withdraw that force, he didn't show or wasn't able to pull together the kind of creative diplomacy that we saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and creating that space and time for diplomacy. Perhaps he could have gone to Cairo a day earlier. Perhaps he could have gone on to Israel to speak to the Israeli government. But at the end of the day, I mean, it wasn't the peacekeeping force that was stopping or could have stopped the war from happening. And in some ways, he was scapegoated for the war when it did break out a couple of weeks later.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, an incredibly complex conflict that no one has made 100% right decisions in managing. So it's interesting to hear kind of like what are some of the things he could have done differently, at the same time completely understanding that there are limits even to UN authority, whether it's the rules that peacekeepers are bound under to not become party to a conflict. But also the United Nations is a organization of member states. And so I think a Secretary-General like U Thant could play a really important mediating role. You've described so many instances of shuttle diplomacy he's playing between these leaders and their envoys, but it's also the responsibility of the member states to create the pressure and the circumstances and the conditions that lead to conflict resolution. I guess I'd be curious how you think, based on your archival research, someone like U Thant would look at the crisis today in either Ukraine or Gaza. Two very different scenarios, of course, but particularly on the Ukraine, what does it look like? What are kind of the mechanisms of managing this crisis when it's really fundamentally about a violation of sovereignty, which should be the UN's kind of underlying principle, but is not being adhered to by some of the members of the Security Council. And then ditto in Gaza, I guess it's also a bit of a sovereignty question, who has the right to do what to whom. How do you think, U Thant looked at sovereignty, and do you think that some of those ideas are relevant today? Yeah,
no, absolutely. I mean, I think in the Ukraine case, you have a fairly clear case of aggression, which goes against one of the founding principles of the UN.
Right.
I think a problem for the UN is it involves one of the big powers that has a veto on the Security Council.
Right.
I mean, a distant kind of, it's different in many ways, but it's still a useful comparison. Some others, which was the Vietnam War in the 1960s, which involved one of the big powers. And so then U Thant was placed in a situation where he had to decide, does he challenge one of his paymasters, one of the great powers that are sitting on the council? He has no mandate, no one's telling him to do anything on Vietnam, but he still does. And he tries for many years to, first to engage in that kind of quiet diplomacy you had mentioned before, but then to publicly and increasingly vociferously challenge the Americans, but always understand where his limits might be and how he might need to balance this in different ways as well, in terms of his personal relationships, in terms of other ways in which he interacted with Washington at the time. I mean, I don't think there are any easy answers, but I think the thing is both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, but also in the Western Pacific, in the South China Sea, and in the Sea of Japan, in Sudan as well. I think we have to realize that, I mean, the UN's core purpose, its mission, is to stop, prevent, or end wars. And I think we don't know what the specific way in which the UN can do this might be. We know when the Security Council is deadlocked. We know when one or more of the big powers are involved and they don't want the Council to decide. But that's exactly when the Secretary-General can play a role.
Right.
And it was at the height of the Cold War when Dag Hammarskjöld, U Thant, really spread their wings in that role at a moment of contestation, when there were different world orders, when people were pulling the organization apart in different directions, that they, as the person appointed by everyone, would have to try to find, as best as possible, there are successes and failures, but I think the key thing is not just to try, but to be seen to be trying. Otherwise, I think the public also loses confidence in the UN.
I think that's true, and I appreciate the case for optimism on the UN. I mean, in many ways, we're sitting today at a time when there's a lot of mirroring of what was happening in the early 1960s, and so there is this possibility that a very strong Secretary General, and this is no criticism to the Secretary Generals over the last 30, 40 years, but that we might need a particularly vocal, public, bold, visionary leader at this moment to deal with some of these conflicts and make sure the UN can fulfill its mission. I have another question for you,
Sure.
just about framing relevant to today's, geopolitical circumstances. So one thing that struck me in the book was a discussion of, whether or not U Thant was a realist or was he idealistic. That's not a perfect dichotomy, obviously. You can be a realist and be idealistic and vice versa. But it strikes me today that, one of the challenges with the Ukraine scenario is the idea that it has to do with self-determination. So the argument from Russia or China is that the people of Ukraine do not want to be involved with their own political system. Could you talk a little bit about how U Thant saw self-determination, maybe particularly in the African context? There are a lot of stories about that in this book, and what he might think about a China that's trying to position itself as the leader of the global South, trying to position itself as a decolonialized power, but still supporting this type of intervention, which seems very empire building.
Yeah, I think the problem is, and maybe this is something that he would have said as well, and many of his contemporaries, if they were alive today and looking back, is that we've unlearned or seem to have unlearned a lot. I mean, in a way, the kind of world we seem to be sleepwalking towards is the kind of world which existed before the cataclysms of World War I and World War II.
Right.
When people thought in terms of balance of power, in terms of spheres of influence, in terms of great power, rivalry, and small countries were there to be carved up, their sovereignty impinged in different ways. And that led almost inevitably, in a way, to two huge wars that killed tens of millions of people.
Right.
And I think in the 50s and 60s, that was still fresh in the minds of a lot of people, whether they called themselves realists or idealists at the time, even very hard-headed kind of people that you might think on the hawkish side of the foreign policy spectrum, I think had a feeling that we have to somehow get away from the dynamics that caused those world wars in the early 20th century. And so the UN was framed as an organization whose fundamental purpose was to prevent a return to that kind of international system, and instead have a different international system. It's never worked perfectly. It certainly didn't work perfectly even in the 50s and 60s and ever since. But I think also from a separate kind of direction, I think for U Thant, coming from an ex-colonial country, I think there was an awareness, and this is true in Africa as well as in parts of Asia, that some of these colonial boundaries are slightly artificial. You have the same people on different sides. These are arbitrary boundaries that were sometimes set by colonial governments. And in this world that we want to have, we just have to live with those boundaries. I mean, the alternative is, again, a return to that kind of incessant warfare, or potential for incessant warfare that we had before. So I think that idea that you become a member of the UN, you are sovereign, the boundaries are sort of sacrosanct, unless there's a democratic and peaceful move to secede from a country, which is then recognized, but not through war, not through outside aggression. I think that would be pretty paramount in the minds also of the Afro-Asians at the time, because I think they would see aggression anywhere as contributing to a kind of international system which would ultimately undermine their own sovereignties as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly kind of complex way of saying we should probably just talk to each other and resolve things through diplomacy instead of moving to armed conflict. But it's incredibly difficult. I think even now there are many people in the policy establishments in the United States and Russia and China that believe that we've simply reverted to the natural order of the world when we have a world organized around power politics, and that systems like the UN should serve a power politics agenda instead of, being a structure in which that power politics agenda can play out in a peaceful manner.
But I think that's why it's so important to think about what we could lose, and think then much more creatively about how the UN can change in the near future as well. Because it's all we have. It's the only universal organization we have. The Secretary-General of the UN is the only neutral arbiter we can possibly have in the world. And as you suggested, I mean, it may not be fit for purpose now, but that means not returning to the kind of old order or the old dynamics or the old way of thinking about things that led to world wars, but thinking about how do we avoid a world war now.
You've really immersed yourself in this topic and this subject through the book and through your personal experiences. What kind of institutional reforms do you think would allow the UN to act more effectively as a global peacemaker?
I think we have to kind of almost reverse engineer it in the sense of think about what are the big conflicts today, whether it's Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Sudan, in the Western Pacific. What are the ones that could actually lead to a great power war in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the ways in which those conflicts could be de-escalated? Could we leave it to a regional organization? Is it a coalition of countries that could provide that diplomatic, or even an NGO that could provide that diplomatic intervention that would be helpful? Or is it the UN, or is it the person called the UN Secretary-General? And what would need to change at the UN for that to be the case? So I think we have to start not with the institution and how do we support it or strengthen it. I think we have to start with the challenge of wanting to avoid a great power war in our lifetimes, and see what we need to do with the UN.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think when you look at all of the challenges that you just laid out, a highlight to me is just the strategic mistrust that exists between these major powers. So there's kind of like this underlying expectation, perhaps, among the political leadership that the power that they have should strengthen and expand. But that's obviously tempered by all of the choices that countries have around the world. So these great powers are all trying to strengthen and expand at the same time. How do we deal with strategic mistrust, right, which is really the underlying condition of not understanding how your potential competitor or adversary wants to do that expansion, power consolidation, power projection?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not so much, these great powers are trying to expand, or it's the governments of some of these great powers, or some people in some of the governments of these great powers. I'm not sure that the general public do. So I think if we take any of these countries, whether it's Russia or China or the US or Britain or France or anywhere else, I would guess that the average person doesn't want a World War III.
Oh, right, indeed.
And I would guess that the average person would like to see these conflicts resolved and live in a peaceful, prosperous society. And I think what we've lost to some extent is any real public faith in organizations like the UN to help deliver that. And I think in the 1960s, my grandfather benefited from not just the UN being a young organization with these Afro-Asian countries coming in, embracing it, giving it this extra fuel, but still a level of American investment and enthusiasm which has waned over the decades, and a high degree of interest and enthusiasm on both sides of the Atlantic from general publics as well. I mean, U Thant in 1967 was number 6 on the Gallup poll of most admired men in the world, ahead of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. But that kind of willingness to give the UN a chance doesn't exist. But I think what's more important than that is to see how, I think what is this instinctive desire of people, and governments I think as well, not to see a great power war. How do we mobilize that feeling towards a realistic kind of agenda for the kind of changes or strengthening of the UN that might be necessary?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that came out in the book, another just interesting aside, is that U Thant was fascinated by UFOs and aliens. That in itself is just, it's a fun topic to explore, but I think what he was really driving at as he worked through some of that some of that fascination, some of the investigation he did into the UFO, the potential for life on other planets, was really about like the global level challenges, planetary level challenges. And of course we face so many now: climate change, potential risk of technology disrupting our lives in ways that are disadvantageous or even leading toward war. What kind of lessons do you think from U Thant's tenure or his kind of sense of that global planetary challenge would be most important to take away as we try to tackle some of these, challenges without borders?
I think but also most of his successors, if not all of his successors, I think really try to position the UN as the organization that can help address some of these global challenges. The pandemics, or global pandemics would be another one that we've had not too long ago.
Right.
I think, though, that we have to make a distinction between the UN being maybe an agenda setter, maybe a normative, setting a normative framework for some of these things, debating and discussing regulations, possibly, and being the answer to all these problems. And I think the UN is not just the sum of its member states. It's an organization with its own culture, way of working, and maybe some of these things would be more effectively addressed through other kinds of institutions or setups or mechanisms as well. I think we need to take a deep dive into what the UN's actual comparative advantages are as an organization in dealing with all these global challenges. That doesn't mean that the Secretary-General shouldn't be talking about these things or that it shouldn't be discussed in the General Assembly. I think absolutely they should be, and the UN should have a role. But the UN, again, is not necessarily the answer to everything. But I think what the UN has to be an answer to is war.
Right.
And so I think it's, I would say the Secretary-General that is successful, or at least seen to be trying to stop wars around the world, and shows that the UN can be useful and effective, is also a Secretary-General whose voice will be heard on these other issues as well.
Right, and many of these issues that don't neatly fit into buckets. I mean, there can be conflict related to climate change, there can be conflict related to technology, there can be political transitions. We just saw last week in Nepal the shutdown of social media becoming a political transition. So while those are country level for the moment, they may take on greater importance to the UN agenda over time. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit about Myanmar. So your family's home. Myanmar has been embroiled in a series of conflicts, but most recently the civil war that began with the 2021 coup. I think the UN has done its job to make statements, to pass resolutions, provide aid, and there are other regional institutions, ASEAN and others, that have tried to advance frameworks for a resolution of that conflict in Myanmar. But many have criticized the UN in particular for not doing more. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit about, just your personal reflections on that, but also the role of the UN in preventing war that is contained within a border and is not between member states. I think that's where we get into all of the kind of thornier issues about the UN's role and how it's directed, because at the same time that we respect the sovereignty of nations to make their own choices and not get invaded by other countries, that same principle also limits in some ways how the UN can respond to a civil war or a coup. So would love to hear kind of what you think about that set of issues.
Yeah, I think one of the big limitations is often that the UN, meaning people at the UN, but also in other governments that might want to help in some ways, is the level of understanding of what's happening in the country.
Right.
And the more internal a conflict, the more internally driven the conflict dynamics are. And in Myanmar, at least, part of the dynamics involve ethnic divisions. Part of the dynamics involve people, especially young people, who really want a democratic future and not military rule. But there are lots of complexities as well. And it's difficult for any outsider to really understand what is the way to thread that needle towards some sort of resolution in the right way. So I think that's a key limitation. I think in terms of the UN thinking about internal conflicts, one is about the specific intervention. How can we stop a civil war in a country? How can we lead it on a path to peace and a better future for people in that country? But I think part of it is also about how do we think about how the global system is making more violence possible. We have to think about things like the arms trade. We have to think about things like global social media, for example. I mean, we're so interconnected in many ways, economically, through things like the arms trade, through things like communications technology, that it's not about a specific country only, but it's about the global environment in which violence or types of violence becomes much more possible. I think in the Myanmar case specifically, yes, the UN has tried to do lots of different things over the past few decades, but right now you have this awful situation of terrible violence in some parts of the country. I think the UN has should have two clear ambitions. I mean, one is to stop the violence and arrive at some kind of set of ceasefires. But the second is to do this in a way which sets the country as much as possible on a path to a better future, a more democratic, peaceful, prosperous future. That's difficult, but I think going back to the kinds of things that U Thant was trying to do in the 1960s, I mean, that has to involve the Secretary-General, maybe personally,
right.
In a very urgent way, trying to meet with as many different sides, but also involved countries as possible, including all of the neighbors, and seeing what's possible. There's no easy answer, but unless you talk to everyone and have that sense of urgency as well, I think it's very difficult to see how the UN can help.
Right, that makes perfect sense, and I appreciate your bringing the attention to sometimes the information vacuum that policymakers, even the UN, is working in. So again, like the kind of, my main takeaways from this discussion are to really focus up the role of the UN to make sure that it's addressing the conflicts that are most critically important for a venue like the UN to address. But also, I think, to work closely in consideration and coordination with regional organizations that might have that on-the-ground expertise, knowledge, experience, et cetera. So I'd love to wrap up by just giving you an opportunity to give us your key takeaway as you, I'm sure, you dived into all of this archival material. You've written it beautifully in this book, Peacemaker, which I commend to our audience. What's kind of your set of one or two key takeaways that you feel are critically important to focus on in terms of this research and book?
No, thanks very much, Roy. It's maybe a couple of things, So one is that we kind of think in the past, because of the Cold War or other times when there's been these great conflicts between different powers, that institutions like the UN are sort of frozen, and it was only in the 1990s with this unipolar kind of American moment that it was possible for the UN to spread its wings. And that's almost the opposite of what history actually tells us.
Right.
That it's actually in these moments of great power, tension, and rivalry that this organization that belongs to everyone and that all the great powers are members of can actually play a really creative role. It doesn't mean that it has to be the creative role of the 1960s, but I think we need to discover what that new creative role of the UN should be. And then I think, researching and living in the 1960s for the past few years and in writing this book, I think we do miss someone called the UN Secretary-General, in whom all powers and all governments have actually invested a certain amount of political capital, and elevated the prestige of that office, so that that person can be used, drawn upon, allowed to intervene in moments of crisis and when especially de-escalation is important.
Yeah, thank you for that. It does strike me that at this point, one trend that I'm noticing is that whatever actions the major powers take that are coercive or even violent, they seem to just be willing to bear the costs. Like the costs are acceptable. And so without that investment in the UN and the role of the Secretary-General to kind of outline those costs and make them more apparent, it's very, very difficult to move the policy needle on the global stage.
Absolutely.
So we'll look forward to hearing more from you and to seeing the results of the UN General Assembly next week. It's a particularly difficult time to meet, but as you say, all the more important for being difficult. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Rory.